The antiseptic scent of finality clings to everything. It's a smell Julian had never noticed before, but now it's the only thing he can breathe. It's in the starched sheets, the rhythmic, indifferent beep of the monitor, the very air itself. His diagnosis wasn't just a collection of medical terms, it was a death sentence written in the language of cellular biology. The specialists had been kind, their voices soft with practiced pity as they explained the odds, or the lack of them. But in the hushed corridors where hope goes to die, one name was whispered like an incantation, a myth, a name representing the slimmest, most impossible chance. Dr. Ilara Vance. They didn't speak of Ilara Vance as a surgeon. They spoke of her as an artist whose medium was living tissue. Her hands, they said, didn't hold scalpels. They wove the very threads of life, re-knitting what fate had torn. Her operating theater was a sanctuary where the laws of medicine were routinely suspended. She took on the cases that were obituaries waiting to be written, the patients who were already ghosts haunting their own beds. Her success rate was a statistical anomaly, a defiant monument to a will that refused to accept failure. She was a legend in surgical scrubs, the last resort, the final appeal before the void. Getting to her was a pilgrimage. It involved months of waiting, a mountain of paperwork that felt like writing his own eulogy, and a series of gatekeepers who would examine his charts, shake their heads, and utter the same solemn phrase, "Your only hope is Vance." Each consultation chipped away at his spirit, reinforcing the terrifying truth of his own fragility. He wasn't just a patient on a list, he was a supplicant, begging for an audience with a deity who held the power of resurrection. He had liquidated his past and traveled across the country, all for the chance to lay his life at this one woman's feet. And now, the moment was here. The pre-op room was a cold, sterile purgatory between the life he knew and the oblivion that awaited. Every sound was magnified, the hum of the lights, the distant squeak of a cart, the frantic drumming of his own heart. He stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks in the plaster, anything to distract from the suffocating silence. Then a new sound, the soft, confident click of shoes on linoleum, growing closer. The door swung open, not with a rush, but with a deliberate, unnerving calm. A figure stood silhouetted against the light, commanding the room's atmosphere. He braced himself, ready to meet his savior. He turned his head, forcing a weak smile for the stranger who held his future in her hands. But the face that came into focus was not a stranger's. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. Time fractured. The world-renowned surgeon, the medical messiah, the legend known as Dr. Ilara Vance, was Ellie. The same piercing eyes, the same defiant set of her jaw. The Ellie he had known a lifetime ago. The Ellie he had promised a future to, before vanishing from her life without a word, leaving nothing but wreckage in his wake. The scalpel that could save him was now in the hand of the one woman with every reason to let him die. To understand the chilling silence that fell over that operating room, the profound, unspoken history hanging between the surgeon and the patient, we must travel back in time, back to a world before the sterile white walls and the unforgiving lights, to a time of worn-out textbooks and shared dreams whispered in a university library after midnight. This is where Eleanor and Julian began. They were not just students. They were architects of a future they believed was inevitable. He with a brilliant mind for business and an easy charm that could disarm kings, and she with a fierce intellect and a passion for healing that was almost a spiritual calling. Their love story was written in the margins of anatomy charts and late-night coffee cups, a bond forged not in grand gestures, but in the quiet understanding that they had each found their other half. They promised each other everything, under a canopy of stars on a cheap blanket, believing with the unshakable certainty of youth that their combined will was enough to bend the world to their design. Their connection was a force of nature, a gravitational pull that reordered their individual universes into a single shared orbit. Eleanor saw in Julian not just a partner, but a reflection of her own ambition, polished and refined. He championed her, pushing her to be bolder, to reach higher, convincing her that the most prestigious surgical programs in the country were not just a dream, but her destiny. In turn, she grounded him. She was the one who saw past the gilded cage of his family name, who loved the man, not the heir. She was his conscience, his true north. Their days were a tapestry of intellectual debates, shared laughter over simple meals, and the comforting, silent presence of someone who simply understood. They were building more than a relationship. They were building an empire of two, a fortress of love and mutual respect they believed was impenetrable to the outside world. It was a perfect, fragile ecosystem, thriving in the belief that their love was the only variable that mattered. But the outside world has a way of breaking down even the strongest walls. The serpent in their garden had a name: the Sterling Prescott dynasty. Julian's family wasn't just wealthy. They were an institution, a lineage of power brokers who viewed marriage not as a union of hearts, but as a strategic merger. Eleanor, brilliant and driven as she was, had the wrong pedigree. She was an outsider, a variable they could not control, a threat to the carefully curated bloodline. The pressure began subtly at first: missed family dinners, polite but pointed questions about her background, suggestions that Julian's distraction was affecting his focus on the family enterprise. It soon escalated into an ultimatum delivered by his father with the cold precision of a corporate takeover. The message was brutally clear: choose the family, the legacy, the power, or choose the girl and be cast out with nothing. For Julian, a man who had been groomed since birth to inherit a kingdom, the choice was an existential crisis. The decision, when it came, was not a moment of passionate conflict, but one of frigid, pragmatic calculation. Julian, the boy who had whispered promises to Eleanor under the stars, was supplanted by Julian Sterling Prescott III, the future CEO. He weighed his love for her against a future of unimaginable power and influence. He analyzed the problem as a business case, and in his final damning equation, love became an acceptable loss. He didn't even grant her the dignity of a face-to-face conversation. The end of their world arrived not with a bang, but with a sterile typewritten letter delivered by courier. It spoke of incompatible paths and difficult but necessary choices for the future. It was a document stripped of all emotion, a severance package for the heart. It was the ultimate betrayal, not just the abandonment of a lover, but the cold-blooded murder of the future they had so meticulously designed together. He hadn't just left her. He had erased her from his ledger. The aftermath for Eleanor was a freefall into a silent, colorless abyss. The letter didn't just break her heart. It shattered the very foundation of her reality. The man who had been her greatest champion had become her most devastating critic, judging her and finding her unworthy of his future. Every shared memory became a source of torment, every promise a cruel joke. The desolation was absolute, a hollowing out of her soul that left nothing but a raw, echoing void. But it is in such voids that new things are born. As the weeks of grief turned into months of cold fury, a new resolve began to crystallize within her. The pain, so immense it felt unsurvivable, became fuel. She would not be a footnote in his biography. She would not be the girl he left behind. She would take the ambition he had once nurtured in her and forge it into a weapon, into armor. She would rebuild herself, piece by agonizing piece, not as Eleanor, the heartbroken student, but as Dr. Vance, a woman so formidable, so untouchable, that no one could ever break her again. The silence Julian left was not empty. It was a suffocating void. But in the wreckage of his promises, a new reality took shape, a faint, fluttering heartbeat, not just her own, but another, smaller one, entirely dependent on her. The discovery wasn't joyous. It was a sentence to a future she never envisioned, tethered to the ghost of a man who chose ambition over her. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. The tears that fell were not of sorrow, but of hardening resolve. She would not be a victim, a footnote in his story. This child would be her reason, not her ruin. The world saw a broken woman, a single mother with no prospects, and expected her to fail. They underestimated the fire betrayal had ignited. She didn't choose medicine as a career. She chose it as a weapon. It was the most demanding, unforgiving path she could find, a crucible to burn away her weakness. Applying was an act of sheer audacity. She walked into interviews with borrowed clothes and a fierce gaze that unnerved admissions officers. They saw the statistics, the impossibility. What they couldn't see was the vow she had made. She would become so skilled, so necessary, that no one could ever discard her again. The years that followed were a blur of exhaustion. Nights were a frantic negotiation between sterile textbooks and a feverish child, between memorizing the pathways of the human body and soothing her own daughter's cries. Money was a constant, gnawing anxiety. She survived on stale coffee and sheer will, patching clothes and worn-out shoes. Every day was a war on two fronts, the academic battlefield and the private struggle of motherhood. If you've ever had to fight for a dream against impossible odds, let us know in the comments and hit that like button to honor this kind of resilience. It was in these trenches of sacrifice that Eleanor truly began to disappear. The pain did not vanish. It crystallized into a diamond-hard core of discipline. The soft, trusting parts of her were cauterized by sleep deprivation and the cold logic of science. Empathy, once a free-flowing wellspring, was re-engineered into a diagnostic tool, a sharp instrument used to understand fear without being infected by it. She learned to build walls, not of brick, but of clinical detachment and intellectual force. Her hands were retrained to hold a scalpel with unshakable stillness. Every exam passed was another stone in the fortress she built around her heart. She was no longer the girl who waited for a call. She was the woman you prayed would answer. The day she received her medical degree was not marked by tears of joy, but with quiet, solemn vindication. Holding the diploma that cost her everything, she felt not elation, but a profound, chilling power. The cap and gown were her armor. Her residency was a trial by fire, where she outworked and outlasted everyone. The first time she stood as lead surgeon, hands holding the balance between life and death, she felt a grim rightness. This was ultimate control. She had taken the shards of a broken life and forged them not into a shield, but into a scalpel, an instrument of absolute precision, capable of cutting away disease and any trace of the vulnerable girl she once was. The rhythmic, steady beep of the cardiac monitor was the only sound that felt familiar. In her world, this was the sound of control, of data, of life measured in predictable intervals. She held his chart, the crisp paper a thin shield against the chaos churning within her. Aortic dissection, type A. The diagnosis was a cold, hard fact, a problem of fluid dynamics and tissue integrity. Her mind, honed by 2 decades of relentless study, traced the surgical pathways, visualized the graft placements, and calculated the risks of hypothermic circulatory arrest. This was her domain. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the surgeon, was in complete command, but the name printed at the top of the chart, Julian Croft, was a ghost, haunting the machine, a variable her scientific mind couldn't quantify. Every beat of the monitor was a drum echoing a past she had buried under layers of scar tissue and success. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. The confident gaze that had once captivated her was gone, replaced by a clouded vulnerability. "Eleanor," he rasped, the word a fragile thing in the sterile air. I never stopped thinking about you. I was a fool, ambitious, weak. What I did to you, to us, there's no excuse. I'm so sorry." The words, perhaps rehearsed for years in the theater of his own guilt, hung in the space between them. But she didn't hear an apology. She heard the echo of a landlord's knock on a rainy Tuesday. She felt the cold dread of a dwindling bank account with a sick child to feed. She saw the faces of professors who doubted her, of colleagues who dismissed the exhausted single mother. His apology was a single drop of rain trying to extinguish a forest fire that had forged her entire being. Her professionalism was a fortress, but behind its walls a war raged. The Hippocratic Oath, a sacred vow to do no harm, was a clear and righteous path. Yet another, more primal law whispered in her ear, the law of cause and effect of debts unpaid. For years, her scalpel had been an instrument of pure healing, a tool of meticulous detached service. Now, holding the weight of his life in her hands felt different. It felt like an opportunity, a test. Was this the universe presenting her with the ultimate moral choice, or the ultimate chance for a reckoning? The woman he had abandoned screamed for justice, for him to feel even a fraction of the powerlessness she had endured. But the surgeon he needed was sworn to save him. These two women, the ghost and the physician, were fighting for control of her hands. The pre-op checklist was a welcome distraction, a ritual of safety and procedure. She ran through the protocols with her resident, her voice calm and authoritative, a perfect mask of composure. We'll cannulate the axillary artery to establish antegrade cerebral perfusion. Keep the core temperature at 22 degrees Celsius. I want Cell Saver on standby and have the TEG results on screen at all times. Each technical term was a brick she laid, reinforcing the wall between her past and his present. Her team saw only their leader, decisive and unshakable. They couldn't see the tremor in her soul, the dizzying irony that the very skills she had acquired to survive his abandonment were now the only things that could save his life. The world had shrunk to this single room, to this one man, to the fulcrum of a decision that felt heavier than life and death. As they wheeled him towards the operating theater, their eyes met one last time. In his, she saw fear, regret, and a desperate plea. He was no longer the architect of her pain. He was just a patient, a collection of failing arteries and fragile hopes, surrendering his body to her care. She pulled on her surgical mask, the fabric obscuring her expression, creating a sterile anonymity. The bright, unforgiving lights of the operating room hummed overhead. Her gloved hands reached for the first instrument. The steady beep of the monitor was her metronome. In this moment, she was not the woman he left behind. She was not the struggling mother fighting for a future. She was a surgeon, and the only heart that mattered now was the broken one lying on her table. Or was it? The operating theater was a world of sterile blue and cold steel, its silence punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of monitors. For Eleanor, this was the sanctuary she built with sleepless nights and sacrificed years. At its altar lay the ghost of her past. Beneath the harsh lights, Julian was no longer the man who shattered her world, but a problem to be solved, a network of tissue demanding perfection. Her team moved with practiced grace, their eyes on her. The scalpel in her hand was an extension of her will, a will forged in fire, now cool and unyielding. The past and future converged on the razor-thin edge of that blade, and in that moment of absolute stillness, she was in complete control. The first incision was a whisper of steel against skin, a clean line parting flesh with an artist's certainty. With every layer she navigated, every vessel she cauterized, she was editing her own history. This steady hand belonged to a woman Julian had never met, one that learned to soothe a crying child at 3 a.m., then master surgical knots by 6 a.m. It was a hand that had signed loan documents with a tremor of fear, but now held a life with unshakable confidence. The rhythmic snip of her scissors was a sound of finality, each cut severing a phantom thread to the past. She worked in a state of pure focus, a place so deep within her craft that emotion could not find purchase. Then, the moment of crisis. An alarm blared, a sudden drop in blood pressure slicing through the room's calm. Her team's eyes darted from the monitor to her, searching for doubt. They found none. Eleanor didn't flinch. Her voice was a low, commanding instrument, issuing orders with a speed that defied the tension. She moved with a breathtaking economy of motion, a master surgeon confronting the chaos that always lurks beneath the surface. This was the true test. Not the man on the table, but the malfunction within him. She wasn't fighting for his life. She was asserting her dominance over death itself, proving that the skills she earned in his absence were more powerful than any wound he ever inflicted. Hours later, the quiet hum of the recovery room replaced the OR's tension. The surgery was a success. Julian, pale and tethered to machines, watched her approach. His voice was a rasp, desperate for grace. "Eleanor, you saved me." She let the words hang in the air, a pathetic plea. She looked at him not with hatred or pity, but with detached assessment. "I didn't save you, Julian," she said, her voice level. "I saved a patient. My oath required it." She paused, letting the weight of her next words settle. "The woman you broke could not have done this. You owe your life to the stranger you forced me to become." Her triumph wasn't in his survival, but in that final, clarifying truth. This was the final incision, the one that closed the wound within herself. Her victory was not forgiveness, nor was it revenge. It was transcendence. She didn't need to destroy the man who hurt her. She had simply outgrown the pain, building a life so vast that his memory became an insignificant footnote. Her power wasn't in holding on to the past, but in mastering her present so completely that the past lost its hold. Eleanor's story is a testament that the greatest closure comes not from an apology, but from the quiet, unassailable fact of your own success. It is a reminder that from our deepest scars, we can forge our sharpest strengths. What adversity has forged you? We explore the most profound stories of human transformation right here. Subscribe and don't miss what's next.